accept God's will for our lives. Am I where God wants me to be? That's some introspection that we have to engage in. Am I where God wants me to be right now? Maybe this is not where God wants me to be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, but right now, this is where God wants me to be. Look back at chapter 12 and verse 1. Let us run with endurance, the second part of this verse, let us run with endurance, notice the race that is set before us. The race that is set before us. There's the idea that God picked up the path of life that He wants Paul Holland to follow, and He has set it down in front of Paul Holland. This is the race that He has set before me. We need to accept God's will for our lives. Is this where I want to be right now? Is this leading me to where I want to be in the future? We ask ourselves. Here the Hebrew writer says this is the path that God has set. And so we need to accept God's will for our lives. Again, we look back at Moses. Look back at Moses in chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure, there's our key word, endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking for the reward. So Moses accepted God's will. When I leave Egypt, then whatever it is that's out there waiting for me in the wilderness, the afflictions that come with being a member of God's family, I'm going to accept it. I'm going to accept whatever it is that God wants from me in this life right now. Accept God's will. That will help us to endure the challenges that come along. It will help us not to quit. This is where God wants me to be. And if this is where God wants me to be, then I'm accomplishing what God wants out of me right now. Accept God's will. Jesus did that as well in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39. Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus, do you want to go to the cross? Do you want to endure the excruciating pain of having nails driven through your feet and driven through your hand? Do you look forward to dying from asphyxiation, not being able to breathe? Do you look forward to that? Jesus prayed, Father, if there is any other way, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless. So when we feel like quitting, when things get hard, we hear criticism from others, we need to have another nevertheless moment. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. That's what Jesus prayed. God, I'm accepting your will for my life. There's a big part of me that doesn't want to go through it. Well, I'll accept what you've set before me. And in fact, if we look back here at Hebrews chapter 12, look down at verse 3. Consider him, Jesus, who has endured, there's our key word, such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Jesus accepted the will of God for his life. Number 3 we find here. Obviously, if you want to be successful, you've got to focus on the goal. Jill was reading a series of books she really enjoyed about young Merlin, and she wanted to pass the series of books on to the rest of the family. She encouraged me to read them. I've read 3 out of, I don't know, 5 or 6. She encouraged me to read them. Read these books. They're really good. Better than Harry Potter. Now that puts them up pretty high, you know. So Anna started reading the first book. Not interesting. It's not exciting. It's not interesting. We checked out the first 2 books at one time. So I said, okay, you don't have to read the second book, but you are going to read the first one. You're going to finish the first book. Read 3 chapters a day. 3 chapters a day, 10 days, had 30-something chapters in it, you can finish the book. So she would read off and on, here and there. come to the building sometimes, stay with me, Anna, read the book. And then one day, I said, Anna, I really would like if you wanted to read book number 2. She said, Daddy, I want to read book number 2. My jaw dropped. Really? Focus on the goal. Focus on the goal. She's now in book number 3. Focus on the goal. If you want to endure, what are your goals? And focus on those goals. Because if you focus on the goal, you're not going to be distracted by the obstacles around you. And so look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Fixing. That's a better word than some translations say looking to Jesus. No, the Greek word means fixing your eyes on Jesus, who is the author, that is the beginner, and the perfecter, that is the finisher, the Alpha and the Omega in John's verse from the book of Revelation, the beginning and the ender of our faith. Fix your eyes on Jesus. I want to be with Jesus. I want to live in a heaven. When we're talking about non-spiritual goals, we're talking about wanting to quit in business or sports or whatever it is, fix your eyes on the goal. Keep your eyes focused on the reward, the promise, whatever it is. Focus on the goal. Here spiritually, we're fixing our eyes on Jesus. Look at Abraham back in chapter 11 and verse 10. Abraham, how easy is it for you to wait on the promise of God? I was 75 years old when God made me a promise, and I'm 80 now and He hasn't fulfilled it yet. I'm 90 now and He hasn't fulfilled it yet. I'm 95 years old now and He hasn't fulfilled it yet. Abraham, how can you keep going? How can you endure? Let's read verses 8 through 10. Chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place where he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. You and I don't know our future, do we? By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. Now, verse 10. For he was looking for a city which has a foundation, whose builder and maker is God. You think the people in the Old Testament looked forward to heaven? They didn't talk a whole lot about it. Not nearly as much as the New Testament does. But they did, didn't they? Abraham looked for a city whose foundation was built by God. He looked for a spiritual heavenly city. Abraham had his eyes focused on the goal. And that's how Abraham was able to live his life by faith. And Jesus did the same thing. Luke chapter 9, verse 51 is just one example among many. Luke chapter 9, Jesus is going to pass through the Samaritan village. That's where James and John, the sons of Zebedee, asked Jesus if he wanted them to call down fire from God from heaven on the Samaritans. But the reason why the Samaritans didn't want Jesus to pass through their village is because, verse 51, they saw that Jesus was intently focused on going to Jerusalem. Now the Samaritans, of course, hated the Jews whose capital was in Jerusalem. The Samaritans didn't like the idea that Jesus palled around with the Jews. They liked it that He palled around with the Samaritans because most Jews did not, but they didn't like it that He palled around with the Jews. And so because Jesus was intent on going to Jerusalem, they would not let Him pass through their village. That's an example of how Jesus focused on the goal. The cross, Jesus said, is in my future, and I've got to go. Do you focus on your goal? Focusing on our goal helps us to endure. And then the fourth and final is to tolerate an imperfect world. How many times do we quit because things just aren't going right? Sometimes you have to remind yourself, you know what, this isn't heaven yet. We are not in heaven yet. This is an imperfect world. And we've got to understand that. Things are not going to work out right for us all the time. Notice back in chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before Him, there's focusing on the goal that Jesus did, endured the cross, despising the shame. He endured the despise the shame. He recognized that this is an imperfect world. This is an imperfect world. Things weren't going to be perfect. Jesus recognized that God did not make this world a bed of roses. But He endured. He endured the cross and despised the shame. If we have to despise the negative in this world in order to be successful, then so be it. But we've got to accept the fact that this world is not perfect. Look back at Noah in chapter 11 and verse 7. Chapter 11 and verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned of by God about things not yet seen, in reverence, prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. You remember how many people were on the ark, don't you? 8. People who study population statistics suggest that the world may have been 1 million people by the time Noah came along. Noah had to prepare the ark with just his family, 7 other people in his family, in the midst of all of the mocking and the abuse and the scorn and the blasphemy that was heaped on them by all the people around him. He had to tolerate an imperfect world. You think he ever felt like quitting? If he's human, he probably did. Of course, he had to remind himself, God's promised He's going to destroy the world with a flood. I better get back to work on this ark. But he had to tolerate all of that imperfection around him. He had to tolerate people not wanting to be what he knew they needed to be. He had to tolerate people being sinners, being atheists, not having any concern at all for Noah trying to accomplish what he was wanting to accomplish. And look what the Hebrew writer says about it. In reverence, he prepared an ark for the salvation of this world, for salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world. Noah, through his behavior of obedience to God, condemned that imperfect world. His righteousness, through obedience to God, condemned those who had no interest in spiritual matters. We have to tolerate an imperfect world. Jesus did the same thing for us. In Luke chapter 23 and verse 46, Jesus prayed to God, Father, in your hands I commit my spirit. He had lived in an imperfect world and he had been crucified by imperfect people. Jesus said, I'm putting my life in your hands. That's faith. And that's courage. And we have to do that in order to accomplish whatever it is we want to accomplish. We have to recognize that we live in an imperfect world. Things aren't going to go right all the time. I'm just going to put my life in God's hands. I'm going to do my best, and God with joy will do the rest. The great thing is that there's a reward waiting. We touched on the reward that Jesus saw in verse 2. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. That's the joy for Jesus. The reward for Jesus enduring the 30 years that he spent on this earth, the joy that was his for enduring was to sit down at the right hand of the throne of his Father. And notice it says there, who for the joy that was set before him. That's what motivated Jesus. That's what kept him moving forward. The joy that was set before him. God set that path in front of him. And Jesus knew there's a lot of potholes in the road between here and there. There's a lot of boulders in the road between here and there. There's a lot of snipers on the road between here and there. But there's joy of him. That's Jesus' reward. The reward for us. Turn back to Colossians chapter 1. Look back at Colossians chapter 1 and verse 12. At the end of this prayer, we saw all these things that Paul said, I'm praying for you Christians about. I'm praying that you will endure. I'm praying that you will be patient.